there's two parts to my talk. One is to reflect in a way which I hope opens out some discussion on the on how we relate to Enlightenment today and how we might contextualize Smith within that. And then secondly, to offer perhaps a bit more provocation when it comes to how we might think of the relationship between sociology and Smith. You know, what questions might a reading of Smith pose towards sociology, and how might sociology relate back to Adam Smith? And more broadly, I think, the Enlightenment as well. So that's basically my mission, and I probably will run out of steam before I get into the meat of it, but you can do that for me. So it's a really interesting time to be studying Enlightenment. When I first began as a student, and I was first introduced to Smith in 1989, the scholarship on Enlightenment was poor. We read Ernst Cassirer. I didn't know about Ernst Cassirer as an undergraduate, but subsequently discovered, of course, that he'd written something important. We read Peter Gay. The richness of the scholarship just wasn't there. Now, when the issue of Enlightenment is raised, of course, there's the question: which Enlightenment, where, when? You could be looking at 200 years of history, 1650 to 1850, if you follow Jonathan Israel's kind of sort of sweeping, broad-scale account of it. But there's many others views besides. It's an extraordinary rich area of scholarship, and I would also argue it's one of the great intellectual breakthroughs, I think, in the 21st century. That the literature and scholarship on Enlightenment is now at a point where we can do the kind of work which Gloria was just describing, that kind of, you know, really get into the grain of a lot of more of the history and comparative accounts of what Enlightenment was, and ask so many more interesting questions in a more informed manner. We can also have a much richer take on the whole historiography of Enlightenment. There is a very long tradition of many critical takes on Enlightenment, which across the humanities and social sciences in their reach. I can share these slides with you, so it's got some notes which I had for students at one time on them, which you might want. I don't know. And there's obviously a more positive historiography of Enlightenment, which we also might carry with us into all these debates as well. And I think it's you can't study Enlightenment without brokering the historiography of Enlightenment as well. It comes as a piece, and again, it's such a rich world, I think, of intellectual discovery, and so much in it which I think casts our own times in new light at this time. Pardon the minor pun. It's very much the case that there are lots of readings of the Scottish Enlightenment, huge debates about where it came from. We've touched very lightly on them today. You know, there's quite a lot of literature about, you know, the Active Union, and the engagement with new commercial society, of course, empire. I still think it's very much the case that we're recovering quite a lot of understanding of the Scottish Enlightenment. I mean, I think people like John Miller, for example, I don't really think have really been adequately explored in terms of how their contemporary relevance and how interesting developments of some of Smith's ideas, for example, among many of the things which we, I think, are in the process still of gathering a new appreciation of. And I anticipate that Gloria might say something about the reception of the Scottish Enlightenment into American society, and I think that scholarship as well is extremely rich at the moment. You know, how was the American Enlightenment formed, particularly by developments in Scotland, and we've touched times on that already in today's discussion, which is again such an exciting area of rediscovery, I think, at the moment. Now, one of the things I like to emphasise about Scottish Enlightenment, and I think is often not given adequate profile, although again we have touched on it today, is that to call Smith, as he sometimes is called, moderate, I did it myself earlier on, is really misplaced when you understand the context in which he's writing. He's writing within the midst of civil war, or some imminent threat that it might break out again. He's also very alert to the fact that however social arrangements are being set in the lowlands of Scotland, there's a very, very different Scotland up in the Highlands with a raw, brutal battle for survival taking place. So I think it's very important to understand that there's taste of blood in his mouth, if I could put it that way. This is not cozy fire chat, side chat that's going on in his work. He's very much seeing what matters, what's at stake for people's survival in the kinds of policies and the kinds of social arrangements that he's advocating. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. It's also the case that he's writing in the context of there being a very highly persecuting church. It's been, Scotland outside of Germany has had the biggest number of witch trials. It's also the case that the experience of the student Thomas Aikenhead, murdered, is that right way? I think we probably could use that word, for blasphemy in 1697, has a living presence. When Smith is defending Hutcheson, the fear that the church might raise up again and operate in this persecutory manner is a very real worry and concern that he holds. I mean, this is the actual depiction of Thomas Aikenhead's execution, and that those are witch trials in Shetland that you can see there, and one of the last people to be executed for witchcraft, Janet Horne. I mean, I think as far as we can tell, she was suffering from dementia, and they ended up burning her in a barrel. Horrific violence. This is part of his world, and it's very interesting. This is not moderate in the way that some in the 21st century, when if you just engage with it at a purely intellectual level, you just don't grasp what's at stake for people, I think, in terms of their everyday life. And I know that Rasmussen is looking at the relationship between Hume and Smith, a lovely book recently, sort of mentions they have quite different personalities. But I do think, some of the risks that Hume is more public with, they're also in Smith's writing in terms of how he may well be received on occasion by his critics. So it's very important to underline that this interesting commercial society, it's a blood and guts affair. His concern with civility, his concern with polite society, is because he, as I've got a lovely quote from him here, he's alert of the Highlands as setting people in social conditions in which they're frequently reduced to the necessity of directly destroying and sometimes abandoning their infants, their old people, and those afflicted with lingering diseases to perish with hunger or to be devoured by beasts, as he puts it at one point. This is brutal stuff. So witnessing the rise of the commercial society in Edinburgh and Glasgow, there's a huge amount at stake for him. And I think it's we need to recover this in our understanding and carry it with us all the way when it comes to our engagement with Enlightenment, lest we lose sight of the people and what's going on and just get too wrapped up in the ideas alone. Now, what I did when preparing this paper, as I went back and read this interesting book by Albion Small, not that well known in sociological circles. It's one of the, it's marketed as one of the forgotten books of sociology, which is an attempt by Albion Small in early pre-Robert Park Chicago school sociology, when Chicago sociology was a more interesting thing, I think, than Robert Park allowed it to be, he's writing at a time which Gloria just mentioned, when there is a recovery of a historical understanding of Smith. And it's interesting reading Small's book because of, I think more so for his account of the intellectual period which he's in, and necessarily what he has to say about Smith. I think his understanding of Smith is not that well developed, frankly. But what he does emphasize is, in the 19th century, we lost sight of of his writings on moral sentiments. There's already an infatuation with the first two books of The Wealth of Nations. The British economists have sort of colonized him and made him their own. But there's a much more critical Smith to be brought out. And he even says, I think oversteps the mark in saying if he was alive today, he'd be a socialist in that, and wants to claim Smith as a founding figure in sociology. It's a really interesting book, I think, for what it represents. And of course, if you know a little bit about that period of Chicago school sociology, what I think it sets the stage for is a lot of reflection upon the affinities between George Herbert Mead's sociology and how he understands, I suppose, our reflections on self, others, social interaction, and how Mead is it can be read as I suppose discovering things that Smith knew, and there is an account of lecturers, students asking him, have you read Smith, and him confessing to the fact that he'd read Smith, but it's not, of course, confessed in his writings, but I think when he was he said he did read him when he was at Harvard, which I thought, again, found very interesting. And it was very interesting also the reference to Jane Addams. I think earlier on, of course, you could talk about Cooley as well as having affinities with important parts of Smith's writing here. But it did lead me to reflect upon the extent in which if Smith is if you like, got a sort of a proto-sociology in his work, if you want to call it that. It's a very narrow understanding of sociology, and certainly what sociology was at the time, and certainly has become since. And I think it does set the stage for asking some more provocative questions about what's going on in Enlightenment in terms of the type of sociological understanding that's there, and moreover, what sociology is, even if I can dare to wrap it up in such grand terms, what I'm trying to do here. So I mean, this is, I suppose, my argument in a nutshell, is that, and it's also interesting to me that Small doesn't seem to be that aware, or aware at all, moreover, of how Marx has engaged with Smith. And has started to, obviously be very interested, is very interested in his account of the division of labour and understanding historical materialism, but refers to Smith's focus on commercial relations as perverted at one point because of the absence of an understanding of the fact that capitalism is driven by capital accumulation. That's the word he uses. Similarly, it's a very interesting reflections in Durkheim, in the division of labour, on Smith. Durkheim, in his early period of his lecturing, lectured on Smith, and his basic argument about Smith is that he didn't dwell sufficiently upon the extent to which the division of labour involved people in a new moral condition. There is interesting reflections upon that, I think, in Smith's work about the position of workers and their he doesn't quite use this word, but their alienated condition, and that's in the workplace, and demoralizing the state. But of course, it's given far more extensive treatment, this issue, in Durkheim's work as well. there's an interesting reflection in Zimmel's philosophy of money. Well, it's actually it's a side remark, not a reflection, but say, you know, Zimmel's reflecting on the fact that Smith appreciated that money exchange was not just about value; it was a way in which new social relations, new social structures were being realized and created in the world as well. And I'll put Weber up there because you have to, I suppose. But it's not. It's interesting. There's no reference to Smith in Economy and Society, but I think he's very much on board with the Marx train in this. And of course the idea of modern society as being akin to a juggernaut, that is from Marx. He refers to children for being pushed under the juggernaut car of capitalism, and in the Capital chapter on the working day, and Giddens, without referencing Marx, Nick Juggernaut, of course, put it together as this idea of the juggernaut of modernity. But there is something in sociology, which is here's my, I suppose, the provocative bit of my argument, which is, I wouldn't say it's opposed to Enlightenment, but I do think it represents possibly the nemesis of Enlightenment. Now, I mentioned Jonathan Israel earlier on, and the fact that he ends the idea of, he says the Enlightenment came to an end, it failed, he says, in the work of Auguste Comte. Why? Because Comte still believed that you could control society in a technocratic way. You could manage social change, and we could have a hand on the tiller. And what the generation in the 19th century start to discover is society is exceeding their reach, society out of control. You know, we have a quite famous academic, sociologist, David McClellan, and I asked him at one point, you know, do you think Marx started to doubt more as he got older? And because we're reflecting on the fact that it took him 23 years to edit the first volume of Das Kapital, and he said, well, you know, I think you're right. You know, if you actually look at his notebooks, he's starting to realize that he just can't see the end of it. He can't see the edges of it. He's desperate to try and just get in, you know, just to conceptualize what's taking place, and knows that the reality is exceeding his imaginative grasp and his capacity to set it in an analytical relief. And I think this is something which you can see in all of this generation, the late 19th century generation, that they start, if you like, if thinking sociologically is discovered by Smith and some of his contemporaries, where that's taken in the late 19th century is to an understanding that human beings are not masters of their fate, that there's little that they can do to bring it all under control. Sociology is in that respect is quite a, you know, I know there's this book called, you know, refers to sociology being caught, social theory being caught between enlightenment and despair. It's not that brilliant a book, so I wouldn't recommend you read it. But it is the case that the despair creeps in. And it's quite interesting to me that if you're going to have your hope, I think you look at that early Chicago school, that critical, pragmatic kind of mode where there is, let's be moderate, let's try and effect progressive social change, albeit on a small scale, in the hope that somehow we do something, we open up a space for something bigger. But a lot of sociology is not pitched like that. It's a counsel of despair. I think you discover that the world is out of control. You can analyze it systematically, but you can't do much about your fate. And you're a victim of it, moreover, as well, which is a pretty horrific conclusion to be brought towards. But it's there. And I think that's, you know, the sickness of what we do as sociologists. So just to bring it to a conclusion, these are sort of what I would hope we can perhaps have a discussion about. I think we have started this today, and we can continue it further. Clearly, there's much which is absolutely compelling in Smith, and much to recover in that regard. About how social life takes place in enactments of, I put here, of moral value, of moral commitments, how it takes place for people as moral experience, and he enables us to think about this in very continually provocative ways, which hold currency right to the present day. And I think Sam has done a really great job of sort of opening up that discussion for us this morning. But I also think if you start to broker with Smith, take him seriously, and moreover the whole development, the trajectory of our understanding of what enlightenment is and where sociology might be situated in that context, you might say sociology in the late 19th century started to expose the immaturity of sociological understanding as it was set in the 18th century and early 19th century. But it's also the case that sociology might, in many fronts, represents the nemesis of enlightenment as well, because what is it doing? It's operating to force people's faces and understanding into the limitations of what can be done, the limits of what can be done. You discover yourself as a social being, but you also discover yourself as subject to social forces which exceed our reach and our powers of control, and moreover our collective powers of control as well. It's not just at an individual level, but obviously we despair at the power of large nation states to wrestle with, or is that the word, is it, direct the course of modernity and drive the train in the direction we want it to go in. So I know it's a big debate, but that's what I thought might be interesting, at least if you wanted to think about the relationship between sociology and Enlightenment, sociology and Smith, to bring into the room for our discussion today.